On the 24th of December 2020, the European Union and the United Kingdom reached an agreement that will mark the future of the West forever. In a negotiation conducted in record time, representatives of all European countries agreed on the terms of the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union, a departure that eventually took place on the 1st of January 2021, and which until now has generated many doubts about its effectiveness. Was Brexit a good economic decision for the United Kingdom? Are the British better off after formalising their independence? What has changed economically after de-annexation? Well, in this video, Visualeconomik viewers, we will answer all of those questions. We will talk about what the great economic promises of Brexit were. We will talk about which ones were fulfilled and which were not. And finally, we will explain what has happened to the British economy after its exit from the Union, and whether it's better or worse off than before. So without any further ado, let's get started. If we want to talk about Brexit, the first thing we must address is why Brexit happened. And not least because, in case you don't remember, the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union was decided by a minuscule percentage. To give you an idea, the percentage of votes in favour was 51.9%, while the percentage of votes against was 48.1%. Only 2% of the votes decided the final outcome. Or, in other words, in the United Kingdom, society was completely divided. There were two very different groups for and against Brexit. The question is, what type of person was in each sector? Why were opinions so divided? In short, with respect to the voter profile, the biggest differences between the two groups were age and geographic area. Look, for example, at this map. With the exception of Northern Ireland and Scotland, the further north in the United Kingdom, the higher the percentage of votes in favour of Brexit. In fact, London was the only English region to vote against leaving. But how can we explain the fact that Greater London was the only English region in favour of remaining in the Union? Well, one reason that many experts have pointed to is that in the past, the central and the northern areas of England were prosperous regions. They were areas with strong industrial centres and productive agricultural areas. However, with the entry of Great Britain into the European Union, things changed. Traditionally, many of these sectors were able to be productive because they had great advantages when it came to selling their products. For example, with the tariffs on imports of foreign products. But what happened when they joined the European Union? Basically, it meant that the United Kingdom also entered the common market, which meant that it could no longer impose tariffs on the rest of the countries of the Union. Nor could it continue to control the entry and exit of goods with other types of restrictions. And, as you can imagine, that suddenly made a multitude of British companies uncompetitive, drove down wages, and increased unemployment. Although, take note, this does not mean that the entry into the EU was bad. It only means that in those areas, and in those sectors in particular, the direct effect was negative. In any case, as economic performance became mediocre in the north and the centre of England, many people decided to move south to areas such as London or Berkshire, where prosperity was advancing unchecked. A full-fledged escape to the great metropolis. However, this process also had additional problems. For example, as rural areas and some medium-sized cities became depopulated, they were left without sufficient basic services, without young people capable of boosting the economy, and with a feeling of political abandonment and a lack of public investment. Let's say that in parallel to the entry into the Union, a strong feeling of inequality was created in the United Kingdom between the South and the rest of the regions. But watch out, because the final straw was yet to come. Look at the second map. What you're seeing now are the areas of the UK where most immigrants from Eastern Europe have settled in recent years. Areas that, once again, coincide with the most disadvantaged areas, and where most voted in favour of Brexit. These immigrants come from countries such as Estonia, Lithuania, and Romania, whose citizens, being from European Union member countries, had free and unrestricted access to the United Kingdom. As you can imagine, this did not sit well with the already impoverished regions of the country. These regions felt that somehow the influx of immigrants would leave them with even fewer of the jobs available. In fact, if we look at the polls, the number one reason why the pro-Brexit people wanted to leave the Union was precisely to be able to control the number of immigrants arriving. Without getting into details, this was one of the main leitmotifs of the anti-European campaign.
Nigel Farage, Brexit leader, says it's terrible so many migrants work in the NHS. Nigel Farage calls for immigration to be capped at around 50,000 people per year.
All this is not to say that there were not many other reasons that Brexit was favoured. On Visualeconomik, we have told you about many of them. But the truth is that these two reasons were not the ones that carried the most weight among referendum voters. Be that as it may, and knowing all of this, what we now want to know is how Brexit could solve all the problems we have mentioned. In other words, how did the Brexit politicians intend to rescue from poverty the regions affected by deindustrialization and lack of agricultural competitiveness? What immigration control plans were proposed? And above all, beyond the rural areas and the people already convinced, what did the Brexiteers promise the rest of the population? How did they convince those who were undecided to get behind leaving the European Union? Well, I can already tell you that what they promised was a far cry from what ended up happening, at least so far. Although, if you want more details, keep listening.
British teleshopping.
According to the Brexiteers, besides immigration, the thing that was preventing the UK, and especially the poor regions of the country, from prospering was the following. On the one hand, a fairly widespread argument by Brexiteers that the European Union was a machine for looting money from the United Kingdom, money that, if it were not sent to Europe, could be used to invest in the weakest regions. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Take a look. In the referendum campaign, an advertising bus was even chartered, claiming that with all of the money being sent to the European Union, about £350 million a week, that's roughly $420 million US, the UK could build a new hospital every week. On the other hand, another major proposal of the Brexiteers was regulatory liberalisation. In other words, European Union has certain regulations on labour, taxes, and even investment that establish minimum regulatory standards for all countries. Well, the pro-Brexit theory said that after leaving the Union, all these regulations could be relaxed to bring huge investments into the country, increase competitiveness, and reduce the tax burden on the disadvantaged. To give a concrete example, it was proposed to eliminate VAT on energy bills, which in Europe is not allowed to fall below 5%. The third major proposal of the Brexiteers consisted of a huge plan to expand the international market. You see, although the European Union is one of the regions most favourable to free trade among its members, the truth is that there are certain problems when it comes to applying the same logic to the outside world. On numerous occasions, attempts have been made to implement free trade agreements with, for example, the United States, which have ended up being an absolute failure.
Germany's economy minister says TTIP talks have de facto failed. In my opinion, the negotiations with the United States have de facto failed, even though nobody is really admitting it.
How can we explain Europe's reluctance to free trade, which is one of its fundamental pillars? In reality, the European Union as a whole is generally favourable to international trade. What happens is that there are certain countries that use their veto power to stop these initiatives. A case in point is France, for example. France has a large agricultural sector that benefits from certain, shall we say, rather restrictive EU regulations. Regulations such as the ban on GMOs, or the matching of sometimes somewhat excessive food standards. Thanks to these regulations, French farmers are better protected from international competition, which explains news stories like this.
French President Emmanuel Macron claimed he is not in favour of a TTIP-style deal with the United States, as no European standard should be suppressed or lowered in the areas of the environment, health, or food.
Now, while Europe, or at least some countries in Europe, vetoed trade agreements like TTIP, the opposite happened in the case of the UK. British politicians were among the most favourable to trade freely with the whole world.
UK must act to save biggest trade deal in history. Negotiations on a historic trade deal between the European Union and the United States are losing momentum and must be revived. UK Parliament.
According to Brexit politicians, leaving the EU would allow the UK to accept numerous free trade agreements that would boost the British economy like never before. More specifically, the Brexiteers promised to sign huge new trade deals ranging from Iceland to Russia. But not only that, they also promised a full trade agreement with the US and expanded trade with Australia and New Zealand. And yes, I know what you're wondering. Wouldn't leaving the EU be precisely a move against the free trade that the British love so much? I mean, leaving the Union would mean leaving the European Common Market as well, so it's not so clear that the total effect would be positive. Well, no. According to the Brexiteers, following the example of non-EU countries such as Norway, the UK would be able to reach a free trade agreement with Europe as well. What's more, they said that trade with Europe would be even better outside the EU than within it, as being outside would cut the red tape and allow business to be done more easily. According to this theory, in commercial terms, leaving the Union would only have advantages and no disadvantages. The question is, was this really the case? What happened to all the promises of Brexit when they actually had to be implemented? Has leaving the EU been as much of an economic success for the UK as promised? Well, it's time to take a look.
If I said that, I don't recall.
Okay, let's cut to the chase. The huge liberation of the labour market, the supposed easing of bureaucracy, and the promised tax cuts after Brexit have not happened so far. It is true that it's still early days. Brexit is a long-term project, and changes take time. But for the moment, the only thing close to significant tax cuts was Liz Truss's 2022 plan. A plan, by the way, that would have been perfectly compatible with the European regulatory framework. So basically, Brexit had nothing to do with it. On the other hand, do you remember those supposedly huge trade agreements that ranged from the USA to Russia and even to Iceland? Well, at the end of the day, the reality is much more decaffeinated. So far, 3 trade agreements have been signed, and several more are being negotiated. The Kingdom has even applied to join CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, and one of the largest free trade agreements in the world. However, the process is going much slower than expected, and the promise of reaching a free trade agreement with the United States, the main destination for its exports, has run aground. The political climate in the United States is not conducive to the signing of a new trade agreement, and the United Kingdom is no exception. What's more, the prime ministers who came after Cameron, think Boris Johnson for example, have been much more interventionist than the British right, who were in favour of Brexit. And the fact is that only the hardcore conservatives, the so-called old Whigs, tried to push through the free market measures of Brexit, but the truth is that they were not very successful in their attempts. So, what happened to the European Union? And is trade between Europe and the United Kingdom better now than before, as promised by the Brexiteers? Well, so far, no, nothing like that. As you can imagine, the European Union did not make it easy for the Brexit politicians. The Europeans put as a condition to the British that if they wanted to have full access to the common market, they had to keep all European regulations intact. In other words, they had to stay pretty much the same as before Brexit. This was, of course, rejected by the British, so in the end, a compromise was reached, whereby the UK could trade with Europe, but with certain restrictions. For example, British products with more than 50% non-EU components, so for example, with parts from China, would be subject to tariffs. Another example is that customs registers would have to be set up to control products, something that currently represents an additional cost to trade in terms of bureaucratic customs costs and in terms of payment of taxes such as VAT. The point is that although the UK can continue to trade with Europe, the process is now much more complicated and costly. Take for example the story of one English trader.
Pre-Brexit, I could count on a resident of Berlin or Paris buying clothes on exactly the same basis as someone in the UK. But since Britain left the EU, I have lost somewhere between 60 and 70% of my European customers. They just don't want the hassle. They don't want to pay the duty and the VAT. Kenneth Mackenzie, textile merchant in London.
In the end, the policies promised by the Brexit politicians have ended up being a lot of hot air. Much ado about nothing. Liz Truss wanted to change that situation, but we saw how that turned out. However, there was one fundamental promise that was 100% fulfilled. Can you guess what it is?
Data shows that just 43,000 EU citizens received visas in 2021, a fraction of the 230,000 to 430,000 EU citizens coming to the UK a year in the 6 years to March 2020.
What the Brexit politicians did deliver on their ironclad commitment against European immigration after leaving the Union, Europeans who wanted to emigrate to the United Kingdom lost all of their privileges. Nowadays, a European who wants to go and live in the Anglo-Saxon country has to go through exactly the same procedures as a Chinese, Mexican, or Moroccan citizen. This has led to the virtual decimation of European immigration after Brexit. Now, practically only highly qualified individuals that can bring high added value to the United Kingdom are able to enter the country to work. In other words, if you're a waiter, a bricklayer, or a plumber, I'm sorry to tell you, but your chances of moving to fascinating London are very, very low. I'm sorry. Now then, after all this back and forth of policies, agreements, and changes in international trade and immigration, what are the concrete effects of Brexit? Are there more jobs? Have wages gone up? Has massive capital investment arrived in the country? Well, let's take a look at the specific figures.
The numbers on the table.
I'm sure many of you will remember news like this.
The UK desperately needs European truck drivers to fix its fuel crisis, but they're not coming.
A few months after Brexit came into effect, the UK began to experience severe labour supply problems in low-skilled positions. Many immigrants who came into the country to work as truck drivers, salesmen, or electricians were no longer able to enter, and this had serious consequences, such as enormous shortages of food or gasoline, because there were no truck drivers to transport the products. Another example of labour shortages was in the healthcare sector. To give you an idea, between May 21 and and April 22, alone, the number of vacancies in elderly care went from 5.9% to 10%. But that is not even the end of it. Remember how we told you that the European Union put limitations on trade with the United Kingdom after Brexit, and that the new non-tariff barriers were a major obstacle? Well, in this graph, you can see how, compared to the rest of the world, imports of goods and services from Europe plummeted completely after Brexit. According to analysis by the Office for Budget Responsibility, imports of European goods fell by 18% as a result of Brexit alone, but exports also fell by 9%. This is very much in line with the experience of the textile trader that we saw earlier. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Maybe the volume of trade with Europe was offset by other countries. Well, actually, no. The truth is that since Brexit, there has been hardly any increase in trade volume with other regions such as the USA, although there have been an increase with other Commonwealth countries. But in global terms, its effect has so far been insignificant. After all, Europe was and is the main axis of trade for the British, and replacing it with countries like Australia and New Zealand is nothing less than mission impossible, right? Having said that, and leaving behind the issue of international trade, the Bank of England estimated in a report that Brexit also increased the country's financial instability, and that through a domino effect. This has placed the UK in a very weak macroeconomic situation with, for example, the pound crisis. The point is that Brexit has introduced too much risk into the short term and has scared off numerous capital investment projects. Be that as it may, if we put together all these adverse effects of lack of labour, reduction of trade, and greater instability, several studies by the OECD, the British Treasury, and the London School of Economics estimated that the consequences of Brexit would already amount to a loss of 3% of GDP and 3.3 million jobs. A loss that would increase to between 5 and 7.5% by the year 2050 if everything continues to go as it has been up to now. And how much is this in round numbers, you may ask? Basically, it would be the equivalent of a loss of between £3,000 and £5,000, or $3,500 to $6,000 per person per year by the end of 2030. Not insignificant, no doubt. Do you want more? Do you remember that bus slogan that said that the EU was a vacuum cleaner for British money? Well, in concrete figures, the weekly savings in payments to the EU would be around £280 million, or $334 million, but the funny thing is that the loss of income due to the drop in GDP would exceed £350 million. All this without counting all the money that the country stopped receiving in terms of European subsidies. In other words, with Brexit, the government has saved very little, and for the time being, it has ended up losing money. And Brexit was an opportunity, but also a risk. In order for Brexit to succeed, it needs a much more agile and competitive United Kingdom. Is that possible? Of course it is, but achieving it will require political leadership that so far has not been seen. And if they don't manage to become more competitive, then Brexit may indeed end up having negative results. Flying solo gives you a lot more freedom, but it also forces you to work much harder. And so far, that is what the UK has not done. So the question is, will the tables turn in the future? Do you think the UK is in time to rectify its course and implement the right policies to boost its economy? What do you think you would do if you were the Prime Minister of Britain? We put these questions to you. You can leave your answers in the comments. If you liked this video, please remember to hit the like button and subscribe and activate that little bell icon so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. All the best. See you very soon.